June 4th, 1916. 4:17 in the morning. A low mist clings to the Stoked River like a dying breath. The air smells of wet pine, cordite, and something sweeter underneath. The first hint of summer grass about to be trampled into blood-soaked mud. Somewhere behind you, 400 Russian guns finish their 4-hour bombardment and fall silent all at once. The sudden quiet is worse than the thunder. Ears ring. Hearts hammer. Then a single green, very flare arcs high above the Austrian trenches. That is the signal. From the Russian jump-off tapes, thousands of gray greatcoats surge forward. No whistles, no bugles, just a low growl of men who know this is the last dawn they may ever see. Among them, Lieutenant Vladimir Litvinov of the 4th Finnish Rifle Division clutches his Nagant revolver like a talisman. His company has exactly 2 Maxim guns for 180 men. 2. The rest carry Mosin rifles, bayonets, and homemade grenades filled with scrap iron and black powder. They cross the wire in silence, cutting lanes with Bangalore torpedoes that spit fire and steel. Austrian searchlights stab the darkness, then die as Russian snipers find the operators. The first line falls almost without a fight. The Austrians are stunned, half-deaf, many still underground. By 4:47, the second line is crumbling. Litvinov vaults into a communication trench ankle-deep in water and finds himself face-to-face with a terrified young Austrian corporal, hands already raised. The boy's lips move in German. Kamerad, Kamerad. Litvinov shoves past him, deeper, toward the machine gun nests everyone said would chew the assault to pieces. But the nests are empty. Only tripods and shattered ammunition boxes. He rounds a corner and stops dead. There, stacked like gifts under a tarpaulin, are 12 brand-new Schwarzlose M07/12 machine guns. Water-cooled, 8 millimeters. Still wrapped in wax paper and cosmoline, the factory grease gleaming under a flickering lantern. Crates beside them bear stenciled lettering in perfect Cyrillic. For export only. Litvinov stares. His sergeant, a bearded giant named Pyotr Guzov, comes up behind him and reads the words aloud in a whisper that carries more weight than a scream. They have no machine guns of their own. Their battalions were told there were none to spare. Yet here are 12 of the finest heavy machine guns in the world, reserved for foreign customers, while Russian boys died in waves for lack of them. Guzov reaches out, almost reverently, and peels back the paper on the nearest Schwarzlose. The metal underneath is flawless. Not a scratch. Not even test-fired. Litvinov feels something inside him crack, like ice on a river in spring. This is not shortage. This is choice. And in that moment, somewhere between the smell of fresh grease and the distant moans of wounded Austrians, the war changes for every man in that trench. Not because they won a battle, but because they finally understood who the real enemy was. The lantern in the captured trench flickers once, twice, then steadies. Lieutenant Vladimir Litvinov cannot move. His boots are rooted in the cold water that laps around his ankles like it wants to drag him under. In front of him, Sergeant Pyotr Guzov is still touching the gleaming barrel of the Schwarzlose, as though it might vanish if he blinks. Neither man speaks. Behind them, the rest of the platoon spills into the trench, laughing at first, nervous, victorious laughter, until they see what their officers are staring at. One by one the voices die. A private from Vologda crosses himself. Another, a student from Kiev who enlisted to escape university, lets his rifle clatter against the duckboards. The sound is too loud in the sudden hush. Guzov is the first to break the silence. His voice is low, almost gentle, the way a man speaks to a spooked horse. These were never meant for us, Volodya. He taps the stenciled crate again. Export only, to Persia, to Bulgaria, to anyone with gold, anyone except the soldiers of the Tsar. Litvinov feels the words hit harder than any Austrian bullet. He remembers the spring of 1915, his battalion ordered to attack across open wheat fields near Przemysl with nothing but bayonets because the Maxims had not arrived. He remembers carrying his best friend Misha's body back that night, both of them 19 years old, Misha's chest torn open by a single Schwarzlose burst fired by an Austrian crew who apparently had no shortage at all. He looks at the 12 pristine guns now and something inside him turns black. Word travels faster than any field telephone. By noon on the 4th, every Russian in the captured Austrian first and second lines knows. Men who have not spoken in weeks suddenly cannot stop talking. They pass the news hand to hand like contraband tobacco. They sold the machine guns. They sold them while we died. A grizzled feldfebel from the 3rd Grenadiers actually weeps openly, pressing his face against the cosmoline-smeared breech of Schwarzlose and muttering, "My boys at Gorodenko, my boys." In one dugout, a company commander named Captain Rostovtsev tries to restore order. He orders the crates covered, threatens courts-martial, but the men just stare at him with flat, exhausted eyes. One soldier, a former metalworker from Petrograd, asks quietly, "Will you shoot us for looking at what killed us last year, sir?" Rostovtsev has no answer. He walks away, shoulders hunched like an old man. By evening, the story has left the Stoked River and reached the reserve lines. Cossacks carrying ammunition forward repeat it to engineers. Engineers tell the artillery and the gunners, who have plenty of shells for once, thanks to Brusilov's careful hoarding, pass it rearward to the field hospitals. In one such hospital, a nurse named Anna Mikhailovna hears it from a smiling orderly who thinks it's just another wild frontovic rumor. She does not smile. She has spent 2 years watching boys bleed out because there was nothing to suppress the enemy machine guns that were apparently never in short supply. Night falls. The offensive rolls on. Lutsk town itself is almost in Russian hands, but the victory tastes like ash. Around countless flickering candles and oil lamps, men who should be celebrating instead sit in circles and speak in whispers that grow darker with every telling. Someone remembers the Grand Duke Nikolai Nikolaevic's dismissal the year before. Someone else brings up the Tsaritsa's German origins and the strange monk who now whispers in her ear. A third voice, hoarse from cordite, says a word no officer dares utter yet: betrayal. On the morning of June 6th, General Alexei Keldin himself, commander of the 8th Army, rides forward to congratulate the troops who had just smashed a hole 20 miles deep into the Austrian front. He expects cheers. Instead, he finds silence. Thousands of unshaven faces turn toward him as he passes, and in their eyes is something new. Not hatred yet. Hatred would come later. Just a cold, measuring appraisal. The way men look at a card sharp they have finally caught palming an ace. Keldin feels it. He shortens his speech, gallops away unsettled. That same afternoon, in a quiet corner of the captured Austrian command post, its walls still papered with faded Viennese waltzes, Lieutenant Litvinov sits down with a stub of pencil and writes a letter he knows he should burn. He writes to his sister in Moscow. He tells her about the machine guns wrapped like birthday presents for foreigners. He tells her the men are starting to ask why they are dying to defend a regime that sells their lives for profit. He ends with a single sentence he underlines 3 times. "If we win this war, Tanya, it will not be for the Tsar anymore." He seals the letter, gives it to supply driver heading rearward, and does not burn it. By June 7th, the whisper has become a roar you can almost hear beneath the artillery. The Brusilov offensive is still tearing the Austro-Hungarian army to pieces. Prisoners stream back by the tens of thousands. But something irreversible has happened inside the Russian soldier. The discovery at Lutsk did not stop the advance. It simply changed what the advance was for. And far away in Petrograd, in salons and factories and barracks, the first seeds of what will become February 1917 have already begun to sprout, watered by 12 machine guns that were never meant for Russian hands. But here's the question no one in the trench dares ask out loud yet. If the generals sold the weapons, what else have they sold? That single letter, the one Lieutenant Litvinov handed to a supply driver on a muddy road outside Lutsk, should have vanished like 1,000 others. Torn up by censors, burned by a nervous orderly, lost in the chaos of retreating field post offices. It did none of those things. The driver, a thin, fox-faced man named Ivan Semyonovich from Tula, read it first. He read it twice. Then he folded it carefully, slipped it inside his tunic next to the skin, and when he reached the railhead at Rovna, he did not hand it to the military postal section. Instead, he gave it to his cousin, a locomotive fireman on the Petrograd run. From there, it traveled in a tobacco pouch, then in the lining of a nurse's cape, then hidden inside a loaf of bread that a sympathetic conductress passed to a striking tram driver in the capital. By August, had been copied by hand 17 times. By October, printed on a secret press in the Vyborg District, 40,000 copies circulated in factories and barracks under the simple title Letter from the Front. In barracks on the Narva Road, men who could barely read gathered around a single candle while a former seminary student recited Litvinov's words aloud. 12 Schwarzlose guns still in factory paper, marked for export only, while our brothers fell at Lake Narek with nothing but the 3-round Mosin when he reached the underlined sentence, "If we win this war, it will not be for the Tsar anymore." The room erupted in a roar that had to be silenced before the duty officer heard. In the Petrograd works, the letter appeared on walls next to caricatures of a fat general selling machine guns to Turks while Russian soldiers charged with sticks. In the Obakov steel plant, foremen who tried to tear the sheets down found them replaced overnight. The ink still wet. Women queuing for bread in the snow passed folded scraps from sleeve to sleeve, whispering the phrase that was now on everyone's lips. They sold us. Back at the front, the army itself was bleeding the story rearward with every wounded man. Trains packed with frostbitten soldiers limped into Petrograd's Meticulously station, and as soon as the stretchers hit the platform, the whisper began again. One soldier from the 2nd Siberian Corps, missing 3 fingers to Austrian machine gun fight a year before, told a crowd of porters and nurses. They had crates of them at Lutsk, brand new, never even unpacked. For the Turks, they said, for the Persians, anyone but us. A newspaper photographer who overheard it sold the quote to an underground Bolshevik sheet. Within days, it was chalked on factory walls beside the hammer and sickle. By December 1916, the phrase, "for export only," had become a curse sharper than any obscenity. Officers noticed it scratched into mess tables, painted on the sides of ammunition wagons, even carved into the stock of a cavalryman's carbine. When Tsar Nicholas II visited the front that winter, a guards regiment lined up to greet him turned their backs the moment his motor car passed, a gesture so shocking that his own bodyguard drew revolvers. The Tsar asked what it meant. No one dared tell him. In January, in a freezing attic on the Petrograd side, a thin woman with tired eyes, Litvinov's sister Tatiana, read the printed letter aloud to 20 textile workers crammed shoulder to shoulder. When she finished, there was silence. Then a single voice, an old weaver with hands twisted from years at the loom, said quietly, "Then we stop weaving uniforms for an army that has no guns." The room nodded as one. That night, the first red banner appeared above the Trugolnik rubber factory with white letters. Remember Lutsk? On February 23, 1917, Old Style, International Women's Day, the women of the Vyborg District walked out first. They marched with empty pots and pans, banging them like war drums, shouting for bread. By noon, 90,000 were in the streets. By evening, the crowd had swollen to nearly 200,000, and somewhere near the Lightning Bridge, a girl no older than 16 climbed onto a tram and unfurled a hand-painted sheet. "Down with the Tsar. Our brothers had no machine guns. We will have no more brothers." Cossacks, ordered to disperse the crowd, sat motionless on their horses. One patrol commander, Captain Lashkovich, was heard to mutter, "Let them march." My own regiment found the same crates at Lutsk. His men lowered their whips and opened a lane. That night, the Volinsky regiment mutinied. The soldiers who shot their colonel did not shout for the revolution or for Lenin. They shouted one thing, over and over, as they smashed the windows of the regimental office. For export only, for export only. And 8 months after a lieutenant in a flooded trench outside Lutsk decided not to burn a letter, the Russian Empire began to die. But the strangest part? Vladimir Litvinov himself never lived to see it. He was killed 3 weeks after writing the letter, leading a night raid near Kovel, shot to the throat by an Austrian sentry who was using, of all things, a captured Russian Maxim. His last words, according to the sergeant who dragged him back, were not heroic. They were bitter, almost amused. Tell them at least this one wasn't for export. His body came back to the regiment 2 nights later, wrapped in a shelter half and lashed to a caisson wheel because there were no more stretchers. The same Sergeant Pyotr Guzov, who had touched the forbidden Schwarzlose at Lutsk, now cut the ropes himself. In the flickering light of a buried candle, he opened Litvinov's blood-soaked tunic, found a leather notebook the lieutenant always carried, and inside it a second letter, never finished, never sent. The last line, written in pencil now shaking from loss of blood, read, "If they ask why we no longer salute, tell them we are tired of dying for shareholders." Gilza did not cry. He simply closed the notebook, slipped it inside his own blouse, and went to find the regimental chaplain. The chaplain refused to read the burial service until the political parts were removed. Gilza stared at him for a long moment, then took the body himself, dug a grave with 3 volunteers under the cover of darkness, and buried Vladimir Litvinov facing east toward Russia, with his naga in his hands and the notebook on his chest. No cross, just a bayonet driven into the earth as a marker. Word of the midnight funeral spread along the entire 8th Army sector faster than any order from Stavka. By the end of July, the Brusilov offensive, once the most brilliant stroke of the war, began to choke on its own success. The deeper the Russians drove, the more captured Austrian depots they overran, and every depot told the same story. Mountains of shells, crates of Mannlicher rifles still in straw, brand new Schwarzlose and Skoda machine guns stacked like cordwood, all carefully labeled export or reserved for Ottoman contract. Men who had charged heroically in June now moved forward in grim silence, kicking open each new bunker with but a rifle as if expecting another slap in the face. One battalion of the 41st Division captured an entire train loaded with 400 Maxim guns destined for Bulgaria. The soldiers did not cheer. They sat down in the dust beside the tracks and refused to move until the regimental commander swore on the gospel that the guns would stay with Russian units. He swore. No one believed him. Desertion, once a trickle, became a flood. Not the panic running of broken men, but something colder. Entire companies shouldering their rifles and walking east at night, calm, orderly, like workers leaving a factory that has cheated them one time too many. In September, a whole regiment of the Grenadier Corps, 1,800 men, laid down their arms near Barnavici, formed ranks, and marched rearward singing the funeral march. When cavalry tried to stop them, they opened their greatcoats to show they had removed the cartridges from their rifles. "We are going home to ask about the machine guns," their colonel told the astonished brigadier. Nothing could be done. The war diary of the German 10th Army, watching from the opposite lines, recorded it with disbelief. "The Russians are no longer fighting us. They are fighting someone behind them." In the hospitals, the poison spread deepest. Men with shattered legs who once begged to return to their comrades now begged to be sent anywhere but the front. A young doctor named Mikhail Volkov, stationed at a forward dressing station near Kovel, watched a steady parade of self-inflicted wounds. Fingers shot away, toes blackened with frostbite induced on purpose. One night a sergeant with bandaged eyes was carried in screaming not from pain, but from rage. When Volkov asked what happened, the man ripped off the bandages to reveal perfectly healthy eyes. "I would rather be blind and see another crate marked, for export only, while my boys are cut down," he shouted. The next morning Volkov wrote his resignation and walked rearward with the deserters. He would surface again in Petrograd, February 1917, wearing a red armband. And still the high command pretended not to notice. Stavka issued furious orders about treason, cowardice, Jewish agitators. Officers caught whispering about Lutsk were transferred to penal battalions. But the rot had gone too deep. In October, during what should have been the final push toward Lemberg, the 7th Siberian Corps received orders to attack across the same ground they had bled over in 1915. The men listened to the colonel read the order. Then, as one, sat down in the mud and began cleaning their rifles with deliberate slowness. The colonel drew his sword and threatened to shoot the first man who refused. A 20-year-old private from Tomsk looked up and asked a question that silenced the entire regiment. "Will you shoot us with Russian bullets, sir, or the ones you sold to the Turks?" The colonel lowered his sword. That afternoon, he shot himself in his dugout. The Corps did not attack. The front stabilized into frozen immobility, not because the Austrians held it, but because the Russians simply stopped. Winter came early that year. Snow filled the abandoned trenches like salt in an open wound. In one such trench, on the exact spot where Litvinov was buried, a crude wooden board appeared one morning. hammered at the bayonet that marked his grave. Someone had carved 8 words into it, with a bayonet tip. Here lies a Russian soldier. The Tsar sold his gun. We kept his anger. The board stayed there until the spring floods of 1917 washed it away. But by then, the anger had already marched all the way to Petrograd. And somewhere in the dark, a million ghosts with empty cartridge pouches began walking home. The anger that left the trenches in the boots of a million ghosts finally reached the capital on the morning of March 8, 1917, carried on a wind so cold it could flay skin. Temperature, -18 Celsius. Bread ration, 200 grams of black sawdust loaf per person. When the queues even had any, the women who poured out of the Vyborg factories that morning were not marching for politics yet. They were marching because their children were eating wallpaper paste, and because somewhere far away, their husbands had found crates of machine guns marked for export only. By noon, the crowds on the Nevsky Prospect were 200,000 strong. Red banners mixed with homemade signs that simply read, "Remember Lutsk." Cossacks sat on their horses watching, sabers still sheathed. One old sergeant with a frozen beard was heard telling a young officer, "My brother died at Kovel with no Maxim. I will not draw on these women." The officer nodded and looked away. That night, the Volensky Regiment, the same regiment that had trained with wooden rifles in 1915, because there were no real ones, gathered in their barracks on the Samsonevsky Prospect. A private named Kirill Timoshenko stood on a table and read aloud from a creased copy of Litvinov's letter that had traveled all the way from the 8th Army in someone's gas mask bag. When he reached the part about the Schwarzlose guns wrapped in factory paper, the room exploded. Men who had obeyed every order for 3 years now smashed their rifles against the floor and screamed until their throats bled. At 3 a.m. they voted. No more obedience. At 5 a.m., they marched out with red ribbons tied around their bayonets and shot their colonel on the parade ground. By dawn, the Pavlovsky, Preobrazhensky, and Moskovsky regiments had joined them. The Tsar's own guard was now the revolution's spearhead. A lieutenant who tried to read Nicholas's telegram ordering firm measures was torn to pieces by his own men. They left his epaulets nailed to the barracks door with a note, "For export only." By the 12th, the entire city belonged to the soldiers and the workers. The police fired a few volleys from rooftops, then vanished. The Winter Palace was empty. The Tsar was stuck on a train at no station, writing pathetic telegrams that no one obeyed. In the Tarai Palace, the Duma deputies argued about what to do while outside. Soldiers who had once charged Austrian machine guns with sticks now stood guard with captured Schwarzloses on their shoulders, finally in Russian hands. One group of deserters from the 4th Finnish Rifles, Litvinov's old division, arrived carrying a rough pine coffin on their shoulders. Inside was a bayonet that had marked his grave and the wooden board that had washed away in the spring floods. They set it in the middle of the hall, like a relic, and refused to let anyone move it. "This is why we came," they said. "This is the real reason." Old Kerensky himself walked over, read the carved words, and for once had nothing to say. On the 15th, Nicholas abdicated in a railway carriage at Pskov, signing away 300 years of Romanov rule with a pen that scratched like a dying man's breath. The news reached Petrograd by telegraph at dusk. Crowds flooded the streets again, but this time no one cheered. They simply stood in the snow, faces blank, as if they had won something they no longer wanted. A soldier from the Lithuanian regiment climbed onto the statue of Alexander III and tied a red flag around the bronze horse's neck. Then he shouted into the freezing air the sentence that now belonged to every Russian who had ever waited in vain for a machine gun that never came. They sold the guns. We bought them back with the empire. 3 days later, in a quiet ceremony no newspaper recorded, the pine coffin from the front was carried through the city by 8 men in patched greatcoats. They buried in the field of Mars under a simple stone that read only, "To the unknown Russian soldier who discovered the truth at Lutsk." No priests, no speeches, no honor guard. Just the wind and the snow and the distant sound of a million ghosts finally laying down their empty rifles. The war dragged on for another 20 months in the West. But in Russia, it ended the moment those 12 Schwarzlose guns were unwrapped in a flooded trench outside a forgotten town no one can pronounce anymore. Everything that followed, Lenin, Civil War, the Soviet Union, the whole bloody century, was just the echo of that single, terrible realization. They sold us, and we finally refused to be sold again.